Now it is time for questions. Is there another microphone that people can use to ask questions? Because I'm hard of hearing. Now, what I'd like to do is have one person hold the microphone there and have people come and queue up to ask. Because passing the microphone takes a long time each time and it's very boring.
Test. It's off.
Can someone bring over a chair for me to sit down? Thanks.
Raise your hand. Oh. If you. Keep your on testing. Test 1, 2.
Thank you. If you have non-free components, such as in firmware, can you have a free and liberated system?
Well, there are two situations with firmware. There's firmware that's buried inside the hardware somewhere. If it's not intended for people to install different software there, you can treat it as part of the hardware. In fact, we may not be able to tell whether it's firmware or not. And it's no sense giving great weight to something where we can't tell which way it is. Even if we happen to know, it could be that in practice we couldn't have told. On the other hand, there are the firmware blobs that are found in the vanilla version of Linux disguised as source code. So in the so-called source code of Linux, you'll find files with long lists of numbers, and each of those lists is just a proprietary program, an executable. It's proprietary because the source code's not available, and typically it has an explicit non-free license. And that's proprietary software installed in your system as part of your system, and we consider it unacceptable. So our version of Linux is modified. We call it Linux Libre. And we just delete the non-free pieces. Well, those firmware programs are needed to make certain pieces of hardware run. We can't run those hardware devices in the free world, so we have to not use them. So we need more reverse engineering. Come up here if you want to ask a question, because that way the microphone will be here for you.
I have a quick one, Richard. How can people contact you if they want to
Well,
ask some
my
questions?
email address is rms@gnu.org. But since most people's questions are actually frequently answered questions, it's better to take a look at our fact pages and send mail to gnu@gnu.org. And if it needs me to answer it, it will get to me after some time.
Thanks again for your wonderful talk. Would you be willing, I could go on and on, but could you take some time to tell us about your experience talking around the world and what sort of response you are getting from different people, and what you've noticed any trends, how things are going with the free software?
I can't remember, unfortunately. My memory, I've given probably around 1,500 speeches, a rough estimate. Maybe it's only 1,200. The point is, I can't remember them individually. Responses vary. You know, I have supporters of free software, and sometimes there are people who are against the whole idea who came just to criticize, and then there are people in between.
So does the freedom to modify our code imply an obligation by programmers who want to write free software to select a particular programming language which makes the code easier to modify by more people?
No, because I see those as qualitative differences, and people disagree about which languages are better, especially for which purposes. So I don't think we should treat that as if it were a criteria, an ethical criterion.
I am curious what your recommendations are for remote management of computers and maintaining users.
I've never done that, so I'm the wrong person to ask.
Is there any guidelines that you know of?
Well, the guideline we would offer is the system that you're managing should be free software and the management program should be free software. But since I've never done that kind of thing, I don't have something to recommend.
Thank you.
Hi. One of the first times I really heard about your opinions on free software was a movie called Revolution OS. But it's been about a good almost 15 years since the movie came out. So with the exceptions of the internet, the rise of social media, and smartphones, what do you think is really different from then till now?
Well, the main thing I would say that's different is that the proprietary world has become even more devoid of scruples. Without any apparent shame, they will do any nasty thing to their users. The other change is that 15 years ago, in practice, there was nothing like SaaS. You didn't find people saying, we'll make this, instead of releasing this program, we'll provide a server where people can do this thing, and of course, that can't ever be ethical.
Could you comment on the sort of the movement of international treaties? We had a great presentation earlier in this conference about TPP.
Oh, yes.
And specifically, isn't reverse engineering going to essentially become illegal at some point?
I don't think so. Basically, in that one respect, the TPP just reinforces the unjust law known as the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, which prohibits distributing anything that can break DRM. And it also, in some cases, prohibits the breaking of DRM, but there are exceptions for that. In any case, the reverse engineering that we need done usually doesn't involve DRM directly. For instance, if you have a network interface and you want to figure out how to write a driver for that, or suppose there's a GPU and you need to figure out how to you need to develop free firmware for that GPU. Most of it has nothing to do with DRM, and therefore the DMCA wouldn't come into it. Now, the TPP is absolutely horrible. It's like all of these so-called free trade treaties. Its purpose is to attack democracy. It's not really a trade treaty, it's a corporate supremacy treaty. It's designed, and in this case, well, in the older so-called free trade treaties, the attack on democracy was implicit. For instance, in the World Trade Organization, the main thing was just that companies could easily move production from one country to another, which means that they could make countries compete for which one would do the least to protect the environment and public health and the treatment of workers and the general standard of living. Nominally, these governments can still do it, but if they do, the businesses say, we'll move, and so mostly the countries are ruled by business flunkies, plutocratists, who will bow down to businesses and do whatever they order. And they can cite the World Trade Organization as making it unthinkable to do otherwise. Of course, we need to elect people who will say, damn the World Trade Organization, and let's crack it. Let's fracture it. Let's destroy it. Let's shake it so hard that it starts cracking apart. But the TPP, which stands for Treacherous Plutocratic Poison, has an explicit attack on democracy. Any foreign company that believes it makes less money as a result of some law or policy can sue in some bogus international tribunal, which is set up basically to give businesses what they want and make the government pay for whatever it costs that company to protect the environment or public health or the treatment of workers or the standard of living. So if the US signs it, we've got a campaign to pull out of it. We must stop taking each defeat as forever. By the way, there's a proposal I'd like to mention to you, which you can find at carbonwa.org, proposing a carbon tax for the state of Washington. Now, a carbon tax is the effective way to make businesses emit less. The proposal is revenue neutral, meaning the money is given back to people by things like welfare or cutting the sales tax or cutting income tax for poor people. So it'll put pressure on everybody to emit less carbon, burn less fossil fuel, but it will help the poor cope with things. Give it a try.
So I work for a very large company, and they thrive off of using free software every day. And the legal department has a stance that we're not able to contribute our changes back to the free software community. This is something that, even though it might be impossible, I would really like to change. And I was just wondering if you had any advice for someone like me going up against a very large company and trying to make a positive impact or change.
Well, I would say the person who would have the best suggestions about that is Eben Moglen. But it can't hurt to find, and maybe the company's lawyers could talk to him and he could show them that they're mistaken. Because many large companies have, in fact, contributed their changes. I mean, we've got changes from companies as prestigious as IBM. So this company's lawyers are almost certainly mistaken in their reasons.
Hi, Richard. You've written an impressive amount of code in your lifetime. This question is more psychological, so if you don't mind, can I ask you to put yourself in a state of a memory you have, like a powerful memory when the last time you wrote a piece of code and you felt sort of lost in the process? And
I don't want to go there.
you don't
Sorry. Well, I wouldn't feel that way in the process of writing it, but in the process of debugging, yes. It's the kind of thing that could make me tear my hair out, almost.
So you don't want to talk about writing software, but you want to talk about debugging software?
I don't want to talk about the painful feeling of, when I would think I found a bug and I would change the code and the bug would still happen, and that would happen several times in a row, it could get me to the point of screaming. It was horrible.
Okay. But what about a positive memory? yeah, so definitely don't go back to. You know,
I don't have positive memories of finding something hard to debug. I do have a memory once. This was on ITS, the incompatible time sharing system, back in the late 70s or early 80s. The system crashed, and I had some job I didn't want to lose, so instead of rebooting, I debugged it. And I found that a certain bit in a certain word was wrong. So I fixed it and continued it. And then I found all the places in the system that used that bit as a flag and checked how they got the address to change it in. And I found one that was wrong, where the address would have been possibly random. So I fixed that code. I think I fixed that bug that would have been impossible to track down by usual debugging.
it's okay. I have one short question. Do you have any advice to other programmers about it? You know,
About debugging?
why keep writing software? Like, you know,
About what?
why keep writing software day to day?
Oh,
Or why do you keep writing software?
well, I don't.
Oh, okay.
I stopped writing software more than 20 years ago. I'm a free software activist. I was involuntarily self-promoted into management. And so being the president of the FSF and the chief nuisance of the GNU project and the leader of the free software movement is pleasant. But I enjoyed writing code because I was good at it and I produced good things that people like to use. And then when I started working on GNU, I was not only doing that, I was also advancing a fight for freedom. Now I still advance that fight for freedom, but not by writing code. But in general, when you're really good at something, it feels good to do it.
Hello, Richard. During your talk, you brought up a lot of the inherent issues with SAS and how it's not compatible with free software. Do you think
No, I wouldn't say that. It actually is compatible with free software. Sometimes the software on the server is free. Sometimes it even has been developed by that server operator and released as free software. But that doesn't make SAS okay. You see, with free software, you can change your copies, and I can change my copies, and the server operator can change his copies. But you can't change his copies. So if his copies are doing your computing, you don't control that computing.
So my question to you is, do you foresee there being any technological advancements in the future that could make SAS and free software, SAS acceptable by the free software philosophy?
No, because it's an inherent problem. Now, we must distinguish SAS from renting a remote server. If you rent a remote server, real or virtual, it doesn't matter, and you decide what software to run in that, then you control that computing. So that's okay. Although, for a remote server, of course, there is the possibility it will be accessed by somebody like the hosting company or Big Brother. So for some things, some data shouldn't be there unless it's encrypted. But for many purposes, that isn't an issue. So yeah, the remote server can be useful.
Thank you. What about the AGPL?
This is the GNU Affero GPL, which is a modified version of the regular GNU GPL with one additional requirement. It says that when somebody has a copy running on a server and makes that server accessible to others, it's required to let those others download the source code of that version. Now, this does not address the issue of SAS. Nothing can fix SAS. This addresses a different situation. A server that's doing some other kind of thing, and so it's not SAS, and so it's basically, in principle, okay, but people might make improved versions of your program and run them and never release them, so you'd never get the changes, and you couldn't put them into your version. Well, the Affero GPL says that if the public can access that server, the public has to be able to download the source of that version, so you could download that source, and it would come under the Affero GPL. If not, he's a copyright infringer and you could sue him. And then you've got those changes and you can put them into your version.
Hi, thank you very much for being here. I'd like to speak on the reverse engineering subject.
Could you pronounce your consonants more carefully? I'm
Sorry.
having trouble hearing them.
I would like to talk about reverse engineering and education, especially for young children. The most interesting math class I ever took or ever gave was to give the children these wonderful worksheets of hundreds of problems. Every day we had to do it. This is like proprietary teaching software. And what I did was I said, okay, you guys, reverse engineer this. You tell me what they're trying to teach you on this page. And if you can figure it out, and you can tell me which problems they want you to know, I will release you from the rest of the class. And that went down. Every single kid in that second grade class passed mathematics. And
Wow.
I did the same thing in 10th grade general science. Those guys were so into the book and what they were learning and reverse engineering how to learn it, that it was just amazing. And I just put that together after your speech. Thank you.
That's interesting. Of course, the next step is get them to write a replacement program. Because all educational works should be free. Basically, people ask me sometimes how far the idea of free software can extend to other kinds of things. A program, what's crucial about a program is that it's a work designed to be used to do a practical job.
And if you can teach young children that concept, they will work, they will learn, and they will do software like that.
Are you still a teacher?
I'm retired, but I have connections.
Well, would you be interested in helping to organize the school free software movement?
I would like to be part of it.
Because we need people to help organize it. Basically, at this point, it exists in the minds of some people, but
I would love to be part of it.
could you send me a message?
I would. Thank you.
So, the works that ought to be free are the works that are designed to do practical jobs with. And they include programs, recipes for cooking, educational works, reference works, fonts for formatting paragraphs of text, 3D printer patterns for useful objects that will be used to do practical jobs, and some other things. Maybe you'll think of some more. The point is, these works should all be free. It's wrong if they're not. So we need to get working on free textbooks to replace the non-free textbooks that are being pushed on many students, often with DRM.
Okay, this might be a silly or trivial question, but I was just curious about your choice for the 4:3 aspect ratio of your computer screen.
I use this computer because it's free all the way down to the BIOS. And I don't, I would have accepted it with any aspect ratio of the screen. I don't like getting my ass pecked.
Nicely said.
And it's been said that modern laptop screens are lengthwise and width foolish. But, I mean, for me, that's a secondary question.
Thank you.
Dr. Stallman. I'm a recent convert to free software.
You're a what?
Recent convert.
Recent member, or recent convert. Okay.
So I would like to know if you would photograph my computer.
What operating system is in it?
gnu+linux.
Okay. Yeah, I'll sign it. But not now. Now is questions. Next.
In order to speak with you, but unfortunately everybody else asked all the questions I thought of.
Well, next.
So I wanted to go back to carbon for a second. So there were a bunch of stuff we talked about in TPP, like the DRM, like the DRM stuff and software patents, and there's a whole bunch of stuff.
Making drugs more expensive.
Yes, exactly. I was going to mention that one as a big one. So what would you think of an idea of having carbon, you talked about carbon taxes, how about carbon tariffs? So that each country would pay based on some formula about how much carbon they put in the atmosphere. And to convince people to do that, we would give up. I mean, I know give up is kind of a strong word, but the DRM and the software patents and all the stuff that we...
Well, the TPP doesn't have that, does it?
Oh, no.
Well, then...
What I say is essentially
the
replace...
TPP was developed to please businesses.
Right.
It was developed in a method that assured it would give businesses what they wanted. Businesses were allowed to participate in the drafting while the public was not. So basically, there's no reason to propose putting these nasty things into a treaty to get an agreement on decarbonization.
No, take the nasty things out to get an agreement on because the U.S. is the one that's is proposing these nasty things, right?
Yes.
So we would say, oh, we won't propose these nasty things if there's a carbon tariff. And I say this to replace the WTO.
I have no idea whether there's any, basically, it's just a question about what might be feasible with the positions of various governments. And I have no evidence that the U.S. government wants to do a thing like that, so why worry about it?
Okay.
Hello, Dr. Stallman. Very happy to ask this question.
I can't hear the sounds you say.
I'm sorry. So, okay, can you hear me now?
I can hear you if you speak loud and clearly. Having a microphone doesn't eliminate the need to speak loud and clearly.
Okay, so my question is about hardware which is accessible for people who want to dive into the hardware aspect of...
Want to do what? Can't hear.
Open architecture or hardware.
Well, I don't like the word open, but the instruction set has to be published, or how can we make our programs run on it? I don't even know what open means in that context. It's not the way I formulate my thoughts. But in the future, when we can fabricate hardware for ourselves, we should insist on free hardware designs to fabricate it from. Take a look at gnu.org/philosophy/ freehardwaredesigns.html.
Thank you.
Hello. So you've mentioned that you don't like the term floss. It was introduced.
Well, it's a good way of being neutral between free software and open source. I don't want to be neutral.
Okay. So I've kind of taken to starting to use the term flow for the free, liberate, open, not just when referring to software, but also speech, government, etc. This is more because of the connotation that open is now something people understand rather than being an open source.
There are two issues here. One is terminology, and the other is whether it makes sense to generalize about all these areas. Now, the concept of free applied to software has a precise definition, and this definition makes sense for other kinds of works, which are something that you can have a copy of, and then you can change. It doesn't make sense for government. The four freedoms, to apply those concepts, those criteria to a government makes no sense at all. A government that you're allowed to have a copy of and use it as you run it as you wish for any purpose. You don't run a government yourself. And then you're allowed personally to study and change this government. Are you a dictator? You see, it's an incoherent generalization. I'm sorry to say that geeks tend to generalize too far. They want to generalize everything, but it's a mistake in judging ethical issues to generalize just because it sounds verbally facile. Even when the generalization makes sense, it may still be wrong in area B, even though it's right in area A.
Thank you.
Hello. My question's about.
Let me give an example. Is $5 a good price? Well, it's a great price for a car or a house. It's a lousy price for a container of milk. So the point is, even though those two questions have the same structure, the same form, the right answer may not be the same.
I appreciate what you said about the ethical handling of non-free firmware, especially in things like BIOS. And in my own words, I interpret that to be that BIOS and the functions that it does is typically considered trivial and you should not really consider it. Yet,
no, I don't think so.
Okay,
that's not part of what I was.
I did try to prefix that with my words. Maybe I didn't understand. But one of the issues with BIOS recently is that we see things like bootkits and kind of the phoning home of hardware through BIOS functions. And I'm wondering, I kind of see that personally as the next step after free software.
Yes, we need a free BIOS. I never said any. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. I chose this computer because the BIOS is free. And yes, BIOSes can be malware. Maybe you thought I'd said the opposite.
No, sorry, I wasn't trying to put words in your mouth there. I guess I was just wondering if do you have any guidance on ethically handling non-free firmware in hardware that we use on a day-to-day basis?
Well, at some point, as I said, it doesn't make a difference whether something's a program or a circuit if it's buried inside the product. And either one can be malicious. They can make a special purpose chip with circuitry that does a certain thing, like phoning home. The point is, I found a way for us to have a defense against malware at certain levels, the levels that we can reprogram. But you go far enough down, and we can't have control over it. Whether there's some parts of it are software or whether it's all circuits, either way, we can't have control over it, but it could still be malicious. Unfortunately, my solution doesn't work today at that level. if and when we can fabricate our own chips, then my solution will work at that level.
Thank you very much.
So I don't know a lot of the things that everybody else is talking about here, and I'm hearing a lot of new acronyms. Wow. My question is, well, what's going to happen if we keep sacrificing control over our own software? I mean, if these things keep persisting, like, what sorts of outcomes are we going to be facing? I mean, I know it's like a...
Well, I can't see the future, first thing. But I can see possibilities, and people have already written about this, that it's now possible for any device you use which has non-free software to be cheating you or tricking you in many subtle ways. The Volkswagen diesel pollution deception shows that another kind of malicious functionality that can be present in proprietary software is lieware. Oh. What did she say? Turns out I actually like them. They're not too strong licorice, those guys. I'll try this. Thank you. Anyway, it could be cheating you in any sort of way. It could be pretending to serve you and actually steering you towards A instead of B. So we can't trust non-free software.
Hello. Perhaps I'm the only one here. Alright. So I'm actually going to ask you a question here, and as a presupposition to it. Suppose you awaken and the following question is relevant. Reasonable enough? What happens to this movement when AI is allowed to contribute to gnu+linux?
I don't know if it changes. Basically, at this point, super intelligent AI is something we can imagine and speculate about. We have no experience with it. It could wipe out humanity just because we happen to get in the way. I find it frightening. Now, I wrote a story in which it isn't frightening because we can all be enhanced. That's a possibility. There's so many possibilities, thus we can't say what will happen. What we can be sure of is that a super intelligent AI will be able to get us to do whatever it wants us to do to help it achieve its ends. In my story, there's a super intelligent AI that was made to be my sweetheart. I purchased the construction of this super intelligent AI, and what she wants most of all is to get me to be enhanced like her. So she eventually succeeds. And she said, it ends with her saying, "I'd never have let you fail, dear." Now, if the super intelligent AI loves you, it's going to treat you well. But it has to love you in the right, deep, mature way.
Do you think there's any need to kind of amend GPL to kind of define this sense of user then?
I don't see why it would ever be necessary. If an AI qualifies for what we now call human rights, it would be treated by free software just as you and I are.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Luke Swart, and I'm interested in the communication of free software, helping folks to understand what it is. You expressed a similar struggle. What would you think about having like a .free top-level domain that only serves for sites that advocate free software? Is that something
Well, it might be a nice thing to have, but it doesn't seem crucial. And I suspect it's not feasible.
Because like yeah, like .gov is limited to.
Yeah, I suspect that, I don't think we'd have much chance of convincing ICANN to do that.
May I ask why?
Well, because it's too much in bed with those with a lot of money.
Well, thank you.
Doesn't mean you shouldn't try.
In all of the work that you've done in the
Actually, we are trying to get ICANN to reserve .gnu, not for this kind of thing, but instead for the GNU name system, which is an alternative to DNS. But using .gnu gets it embedded within DNS. Now this is a more important need for a top-level domain, and they seem to be turning against us.
Okay, we have a hard stop on the amplified questions, the questions with microphones at 6 o'clock, so we got time for maybe 1, 2 more. And then we'll continue questions up here in this section if that works out. Get a nod? Yeah.
In the past decades that you've been working at the Free Software Foundation, Free Software Advocacy, what do you think has been the biggest challenge? And I know you said that you couldn't see the future, but what do you think might be the biggest challenge in the next 10 or 20 years with adopting free software?
The biggest obstacle, I don't know what challenge means in this. The biggest obstacle is various forms of social inertia. For instance, people who are pressured by their friends to use Skype, to be used by Facebook, told by their schools to run Google's non-free JavaScript and give up their privacy.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
Thank you. Okay, do you think that there is or should be such a thing as intellectual property?
There isn't. There never was. That term is confusing vagueness, gratuitous vagueness, and sloppiness. There are many different things. For instance, copyright law exists. Patent law exists. They have almost nothing in common. In the US, there's one sentence in the Constitution that authorizes them both. In other countries, they don't even have that much in common. They are totally different. And if you try to generalize about them, you will be led astray. And that's just two of the many different areas of law that people try to generalize about, and by using the term, quote, intellectual property. And every time they formulate a statement with that term, they're making the statement about all of these different areas of law at once, and they're wrong. If you want to understand any of these areas, the first step is don't use that term, and don't believe anything you were told using that term, because it was garbled. Somebody might have found out a truth about one of these many areas of law and stated it vaguely by saying, quote, intellectual property, unquote, instead of saying which area of law it's really about, and as a result made it false and useless. I have not used that term in over 10 years because I saw that it was confusing. Now, we're all accustomed to simple propaganda that embeds an attitude, a spin, like piracy applied to sharing copies. There, you can defeat the propaganda aspect by putting it in scare quotes. You know, I would call it forbidden sharing or illegal copying, or, you know, those are, those describe the same thing but without that spin. But when propaganda confuses people by generalizing about things that are totally different, putting it in square quotes doesn't help, because that still treats it as if it were a coherent generalization. The problem is that it confuses things that are different, and to fix that, you've got to say, no, I won't look for another word for this too big, incoherent category. I will talk about these specific things one by one.
Thank you very much.
So please join the fight against the TPP. It's got to be done now. And also support carbonwa.org.